and welcome to the CCDA podcast. My name is Lawson Wijesooriya. I am the Chief of Staff to Mayor Danny Avula here in Richmond, Virginia. And I've actually been a part of a CCDA member congregation for my whole adult life and have great memories of when I went to some CCDA conferences in my 20s. And I am your host for this episode. Today, I am joined by a very special guest and happens to be one of my dearest friends, Mayor Danny Avula. Welcome. Can you tell us about yourself?
Lawson, thanks so much. And hey, everybody, great to be with you all. This is really a treat. CCDA has been a huge part of my family's life, our collective life in community over the last 20 plus years that we've been living and serving in Richmond, Virginia. I have been blessed enough to be able to serve as mayor of the city for the last 18 months, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but Lawson was a huge part of that, not only getting us into office, but also the entirety of this 20 plus year journey. And so I am a husband, father, have 5 kids that we've raised here in Richmond. I'm a physician by training, a pediatrician and a public health doc. I've spent most of my career in the public sector. We've been on a wild journey as mayor and chief of staff these last 18 months. So thrilled to share more about that with y'all.
Yeah. Well, I know we both are really excited about the CCDA conference coming to Richmond for the first time this October. We really can't wait. So I figured let's start with sharing a little bit of when did we first hear about these community principles? And John Perkins, of course, is a big part of that story. So kick us off, Danny.
I think it takes us back to our teenage years, right? I mean, we met at the University of Virginia in the late 90s. I was there from I was class of 1999 at the University of Virginia. Lawson was a few years behind us, but there was a movement on grounds at UVA actually started by one of my roommates who eventually became Lawson's husband, a wonderful friend named Ramesh, who, along with some other students, heard about John Perkins and Voice of Calvary Ministries. And I think in response to seeing some of the kind of disconnection of the Christian community at UVA, the fact that particularly along racial lines, there were large ministries serving white students and more focused on the Asian community or the Black community, and not a lot of intersection. And so there was a group of students who decided that they were going to do an alternative spring break trip down to Jackson, Mississippi. And I was not part of that trip, but my wife was, and Lawson's husband were part of that initial trip. And that was a trip that became it was so impactful for the students who went, for the relationships that came out of it, for the impact that group of students had on the university community. And so for successive years, this alternative spring break trip down to Jackson continued. And Lawson, I know you joined that at some point, so I'd love to hear kind of how you got plugged in and what some of your early responses from that were.
Yeah, I went on the 1999 trip, which was the second year. And I've often joked with folks that it was a good thing I didn't get sick, because it was a very big week in my life where really my probably entire trajectory changed, of feeling like I understood grace for the first time, began to take my faith seriously. And it was in large part because of the witness and testimony of both John Perkins himself, but really this movement of Christians that were responding to a call to build kingdom in a way focused on justice and on kind of the wholeness of that upside down kingdom. And I was riveted at every level. I just wanted to be all in. If this is what Jesus was about, and this is what these people were about, then I wanted to kind of jump in with both feet, which I did after the trip, and then went on successive trips, as you shared. And it was really great.
The power of that experience, the power of that, that movement coming back to university not only like had really cool impacts on the Christian community at UVA, but also in the context of forming deep friendships across background and racial lines, but also, really becoming the blueprint in so many ways of how some of us would choose to live our lives in the long term. I remember, so probably I lived with 11 guys in a place called the Center for Christian Study, and it was a group of guys who just like loved each other, were really deep in relationship with one another, were really committed to thinking about how we would engage our university community together. And I remember at the end of college, sort of that time wrapping up, and all of us just feeling this ache about the fact that we were literally going all over the world, and wondering, like, how do we preserve this? Like, this has been such a rich, informative experience, living together, serving together, and yeah, like, what would it look like for that to continue in some way, shape, or form into the future? And that was a question I think, we and it's kind of the broader community, as we all ended up getting married over the next few years, and that we would come back to time and time again. And I had started medical school, others had started seminary, some folks were doing different kinds of work all over the country, and so this nagging question of how do we take the things that this group of students experienced in Jackson, the principles of living incarnationally, of living your lives out for particularly across racial and socioeconomic lines, and doing this like deep community development work. Like, how do we make that a part of our lives? And um, it's a question we kind of batted around for 4 or 5 years as we were kind of progressing through grad school and other experiences. And there was a point, I think, when Ramesh and I both were finishing up medical school and having to decide, okay, where do we want to prioritize being for residency? Another one of our friends, Corey Widmer, was finishing up seminary, um, and and there was a point where like the conversation had gone on long enough, and Lawson, I very vividly remember being like, "Hey, it's time to make a decision." You said it with some, zestier words than that, uh, but I do think like that push to say, okay, like we have been thinking about, talking about, praying about like what door might open for us to move with intentionality into a community. And we were kind of like just logistically getting to a place in life where, okay, like we can actually make some countercultural decisions to not just go where the best job is or go to the best residency opportunity, but to really like make some intentional decisions about what's important to us.
Yeah. And Danny, will you share? Because I think that's right on. And at that point of our readiness to really live out this kind of relocation uh, journey, why Richmond? How did we get to Richmond specifically, and what part of like Richmond's story essentially did we feel a part of?
Yeah, so at the time, my wife Mary Kay and I were the only of the group of friends who ultimately ended up in Richmond. We were there. I was in medical school there, and that's what had brought us to Richmond. And I would say Mary Kay, who actually grew up in Richmond, never had any intentions of going back, but God had a different plan, and so we ended up there for med school. And I really did think that I would be heading to DC or Atlanta or somewhere else for the next stage of life. But during my time in med school, one of the things I increasingly became interested in and focused on from a career standpoint was really thinking about the intersections of poverty, race, and health outcomes. And I was doing some work in one of our large public housing communities, some health education work, setting up health fairs for the med students. And I met a man named Don Coleman. And Don was working at a nonprofit in Creighton Court at the time. Don had grown up in public housing, had lived his entire life in Richmond, was a pastor and a community activist, and just somebody who had like devoted his life to the East End neighborhood of Richmond. And through that relationship with Don, through seeing his commitment to that community and his heart for the East End, and just our growing relationship over time, um, that like there was something about that we wanted to be a part of. And so there was a process, like a discernment process, that we started inviting this group of friends into, and folks would come and visit Richmond. We would meet with different people around the city, really just like looking at where God was already working and where could we be a part of that, where could we join in his work with the passions and talents that we brought to the table. And there was one of our friends, Matt and Catherine Ilian, in the midst of this, really just felt like that there needed to be an invitation, right, for a group of students or young adults who were mostly white, not entirely, but to move into a community of color. Like we really wanted there to be an opening and an invitation. And I think through our relationship with Don and a couple of other folks who very explicitly said, hey, you guys should think about coming and moving into this community, just felt like such an answer to that conviction on Matt's part, and really our prayer that we would be invited into a place to join in work. And so that very shortly after that, three of the couples made the move to Richmond, and a fourth joined a year later. And it was such an adventure to kind of be in that, making these huge moves together, and really feeling like we were being invited into God's incredible work here.
Yeah, definitely submission to like local Black leadership was really important to us. And so much so that invitation moment that did feel very spirit led, we literally moved onto the same street as one of the leaders who had invited us. We're like, okay, that means that we will go actually here and buy our houses. I don't think it had to have been taken that literally, but we did. So, yeah, that's great. Well, let's kind of bridge a little bit to, you are now the mayor of Richmond, Virginia. What would you say in that formative kind of value time when we were making those decisions about how we want to live our life? Like how did those things lead you into public service in the government? Take us a little bit through how we get to you being the mayor.
Yeah. It's a pretty big bridge. It was a 20 plus year arc, but and one that I just, I don't think any of us really ever contemplated. There was zero aspiration on my part to be an elected official. I think all of us, like the group of friends that made that move and the broader community that we became a part of, were just looking for very practical ways to live in this neighborhood, to be neighbors, to serve our neighborhood. And that happened in lots of very cool, practical ways, right? I was as a physician, went through kind of a couple of different training. I did a residency in pediatrics, and then in public health and preventive medicine. And I joined the health department as a leader here back in 2009. And so a lot of my work was very practically involved in the East End of Richmond and neighborhoods like that, where we were addressing health outcomes in low-income communities. Lawson, you took a teaching job at a Christian private school initially, and then kind of moved through education, but ultimately ended up leading an amazing nonprofit called Blue Sky Fund that was committed to creating outdoor experiences and outdoor education for low-income kids who've never had those kinds of experiences. My wife, Mary Kay, started teaching in the elementary school in our neighborhood. And just so many different. I think the decisions that all of this group of friends were making were so aligned to how do we follow the gifts that we've been given and use those for the good of our community. And so I think all of us were just looking for ways that those worlds would come together. And there was, yeah, I think especially in those early years, there was such a sense of like being on mission together and building relationships and sharing burdens. And then moved into a phase of life where we started having kids and raising families together, and doing that with like the full support and integration of a broader community. I'm sure we can talk a lot more about that. But I think to this question of like how did being mayor happen? About 10 years ago, my I was the public health director for the city, and so a lot of my work, in looking at what things impact health of communities, right? And how do you address things like chronic disease rates or access to healthcare or overall health outcomes at the neighborhood or community level? Um, Part of the place that my work took me was that health is in part determined by whether you have access to a doctor or not, but in much larger part determined by, the education level that you attain and the income level of your family and the stability of your family and the built environment that you live in and all of these kind of broader social factors. And so a lot of my work as a public health leader here really looked at this intersectional space between health and housing, health and community development, health and economic development. And it meant that I was involved in a pretty broad network. And so it was during that time, about 10 years ago, that Pastor Don pulled me aside and he was like, "Hey, man, I just want you to know that I am praying that you would one day consider running for mayor here." And I was like, "That sounds crazy." And my wife was like, "That definitely sounds crazy." And something that kind of stepped away, never really considered. And I promise you, like once a year, Don would reach out and he said, "Hey, man, still praying for that." And I think that, again, like even in like the months leading up to us deciding to run, was not something we were actually considering. I was actually helping a friend who was a sitting city councilman get ready for his mayoral run, and I think that there was a window where people just started calling me left and right and saying, "Hey, you should really think about putting your hat in the ring." And so, along with you and Ramesh and our closest group of friends, again, like going to our knees and really discerning, like, is this something that God could be calling us to? A huge part of that was Lawson's willingness to quit her job to come on and to run the campaign, and eventually for us to be partnered as we are in this work. But yeah, I mean, it was just again like not something that we'd ever planned for. I mean, there are a few things that probably contributed to um, our collective success. One of those things being just Lawson is amazing at connecting in community. She's amazing at raising money. Like the campaign was really artfully and skillfully done. Um, but prior to that, in my public health role, I was again public health director during COVID. And so I was the person who was kind of the face of the community response to in Richmond and the surrounding county. And then later, the governor had asked me to come to the state level and to run the COVID vaccine response for the state of Virginia. And so, there was just a season of a couple of years where I was very visible on TV, on the news, 4 days a week for a bunch of 2020 and then a few months of 2021. And so when we started knocking doors and getting out in community, when we launched the campaign, it was just, I mean, it was really cool. Like even a few years removed, 4 years removed from that season, people were like, "Oh, you're the COVID doc." Like they were so happy to see me. And I think the trust and credibility that season afforded, along with, like 20 years of living in and working in community in so many different ways. I think we worked hard for it, but we had a pretty open path to it, and so now we're 18 months in.
Yeah, and I think I just want to share for the CCDA audience in particular that one of the things I experienced during the campaign was I would actually get really defensive at times because we were entering this very political world where we're obviously talking about values and you're talking about real things about how you want to serve the community. But in the political sphere, it is often about that. Can you, do you check all the right boxes? Do you say the right things? Are you democratic enough? Are you this? And time again, I would just come back to like, Danny has lived this. Like these values that we're talking about, these things that we're promising we want to do for a thriving Richmond, like he's lived them 10 times better than the super democratic consultants, like, and I think that, yeah, so I just want to like share that as a part of what kind of coming into this political life that, yeah, that has lots of pros and cons, and that we need people, we need people who have lived out the values in another context, to also then be serving in our representative democracy, in my opinion. And I just think that came up a lot as you're making that bridge from kind of living out these values to then trying to represent them and trying to craft them in the political sphere. I would just say that the depth of the way in which Danny had lived out those values, to me, was like the most authentic thing that we had in order to give. And the thing that continues, to be honest, it continues to be something that I don't even know a lot of people still trust, which is that Danny and I, like, we are doing this because of what we perceive as our call to this city and to this place and to this people, and not actually because of the position or what comes next or the method, like the method of politics or the method of being an elected official. It really comes from actually the like the motivation that we found by living it out for the city and for the people. So
I think that links to some of what we were talking about earlier about the why Richmond. I got really micro about how the invitation came and what we joined, and I think there's a more macro story about our city that it's worth us talking about, which is that Richmond's unique place in this country's history was super compelling to us. You think about the fact that this city was in so many ways the birthplace of the domestic slave trade here in the United States. It was the place where thousands upon thousands of enslaved Africans were brought up the James River and walked through what we now call the Trail of Enslavement to Shockoe Bottom, and they were held in slave jails, for weeks on end before they were sold off and sent further south. And ultimately, Richmond became the capital of the Confederate States, right? It was the political and governmental stronghold to try to preserve this absolutely atrocious practice of slavery. And the reality is that history is so baked into Richmond, who Richmond is, and that has, the demons of that past still play out in so many ways here. And I think, when we got here 22 years ago, Monument Avenue was lined with these, 60 to 100-foot monuments to Confederate leaders. And there were these constant reminders of, what the city was about and what the ethos of Richmond was for so long. And in some ways, like, those realities being so in your face made conversations about race and class and history so ever present. And I think in our early years, like, there was no way around like really grappling with like where Richmond had come from. And I think in many ways has particularly in recent years, like since 2020, since George Floyd, since the racial reckoning, since the monuments came down, like absolutely accelerated like the deep commitment to racial healing that exists among so many people. Now, like we have so much more work to do as a city, but I think that history and that reality of who Richmond is and where we've been, I think played a lot into our sense of calling to be here and to participate in that work.
Yep, that's right. Um, yeah, I do think. I think one of the things this audience might be interested in is just thinking about, how does the Christian community that is seeking to, love and serve their neighbors and to build kingdom here on earth, like how how should they be thinking about interacting with a local government, or government at all? And maybe just to tee up specifically for you, I think a place that you experienced during COVID is a really interesting one, to just share like how central the faith community was, in kind of what the business of government needed to be doing, in an intense time. So yeah, share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in my work in health and healthcare and public health, there are lots of different spaces where we were connecting with faith communities, right? I think given particularly kind of the racial division that exists in Richmond as a city, and certainly in the Christian community in Richmond, the way to get information out and the way to leverage, credible messengers when, governmental public health had a pretty rough track record in Black communities, right? For decades, governmental public health, was very abusive of communities of color, subjecting them to probably the most well-known example is the Tuskegee experiments, where Black men with syphilis were recruited into a governmental study, and there was just a lot of deceit and subterfuge that ended up having a lot of Black men who were actually infected with syphilis or not treated with syphilis, and watching the impacts of the disease. And so Tuskegee, but so many other examples over our history that eroded trust in communities of color with the government. And so I think the efforts to really connect with faith communities, to build credibility, to build trust through, really credible leaders was really important. And probably no more time was that more evident than COVID, where, the immediate distrust of what the government was saying, right? Like, do we wear masks or do we not wear masks? When we started to get access to testing at scale and wanted to go out and provide community testing opportunities so people could know whether they had contracted the virus or not. Here in Richmond, we were doing a lot of that in public housing communities because that's, many of our low income residents didn't have access to regular healthcare. And so immediately on social media, the warnings from people saying, hey, don't participate in testing. The housing authority, if you test positive, they're going to use that as a reason to evict you, right? Like, I think that's an example of just the deep distrust that existed in government, but also in what was happening with COVID at the time. And, thankfully, so much of our work over the previous decade in COVID, a lot of our work was actually building trust in those communities, hiring residents as community health workers so that they could be representatives of public health on the ground. In fact, in our big 6 public housing communities, we had an on-the-ground clinic that was staffed by a community health worker resident from that neighborhood, and then a nurse and a nurse practitioner. And so we had done a lot to combat and overcome that, thankfully, in the decade leading up to that. But the fact remains that there is just deep distrust, and so really relying on the faith community was crucially important. When I moved to the state role and we were, leading the charge for vaccination across the state, remember in the early days, people like didn't know what to believe and who to trust. And we and some of our partners at the Virginia Commonwealth University's Cancer Center, Massey Cancer, had started a network called Faith and Facts Fridays, and it was it was started during COVID, and it was a virtual gathering of pastors and other faith leaders who would join every Friday and just have an opportunity to learn about a topic, a health related topic. And at that time, it was like all COVID all the time, and then to ask questions and over time, what happened as a result of that is that you had this incredibly engaged group of pastors and other faith leaders who had built a connection to Massey Cancer, had built a connection to public health. And so when it came time to roll out mass vaccinations, so many of those pastors were the first to raise their hands and say, hey, I would love to get vaccinated on camera so I could validate this for my congregation or for my sphere of influence. Or, hey, come to my church and we'd love to do mass vaccination here. And what that resulted in was over the course of that vaccination period, we actually had a 2% higher rate of COVID vaccination in Black adults than in white adults across the state of Virginia. And for anyone who pays attention to vaccination numbers, that is never the case. Usually it's 2x the other way, that we have about twice the vaccination rate in the white community that we do in the Black community across flu vaccination or standard vaccinations. But and so this was a real outlier, and I think so much in part because of faith leaders who stepped up, who got engaged, and who really joined the effort to help their communities know what to do in a time where people didn't know who to turn to.
I'm thinking that it's also maybe important for us to share, what have been certainly when we share about the early years and then, and then we had this amazing run and became mayor. I think that can sometimes gloss over the times that are really hard or times where, just, kind of living out CCDA principles, where reality doesn't always meet our intentions. Is there anything you'd like to share, just a journey along the way of what comes to mind for me is our involvement in our public school system and navigating that with our kids, or even now, maybe if you could speak to how much race plays a part in leadership in our city in ways that make it difficult to navigate forward, and maybe just share a little bit of the harder times.
Yeah. Well, I would say, particularly in the early years, I think all of us, this group of friends and our broader church community, which we should also talk about, but I think the choices we were making to open up our homes to neighbors, to be really deeply committed to building relationships across race and class, I think just presented so many challenges, but also so many chances to grow and to be shaped and to be formed. I mean, in the first year, the number of times that people would be like, are you cops? Because that was the only plausible reason they could come up with for why we would live in that neighborhood. And thankfully, my wife had started teaching in that neighborhood. Ramesh and I were both doing residency right across the bridge downtown, and so we sort of said no. We wanted to live in the community that we're working in, and wanted to really embrace being in a place where diversity matters, and we'd have the opportunity to kind of be connected to people who don't share the same background that we do. And it took time for people to be open to that, I think. And it took hours and hours on front porches. And, it took many families, many of us opened up our homes to other families living with us, right? I think both of us have had, I can't even count the number of kids, families that have spent sometimes years in our home. I mean, I think of a family that lived with you guys for 3 years or more, and that you are in still deep relationship with. And so I think so much of uh, especially early on, like trying to build that trust and trying to um, uh, yeah, I just navigate power dynamics and the fact that like we were people who had means, right? Like we were doctors and teachers and nurses that had steady incomes and could afford to be where we were and could afford to renovate houses or could afford to move to a larger house when our families got big enough, and having so many neighbors that was not the case for. And um, so I think there was a lot of like learning and ultimately like the way that God shaped us in like really learning to be generous in different ways, but also learning how much we have to learn from our neighbors who don't share that, right? And I think like knowing what a community should look like and the way that neighbors are family to each other and support each other and are in the like details of each other's daily lives together. Like growing up in the suburbs, that was never my experience. And in Churchill, I had neighbors who would like knock on my door and be like, "Hey, the street sweeping's coming. Move your car before it gets towed." Or I remember very early on, someone like my lawnmower was in the backyard and someone ran off with it. And I was like, ah, man, I shouldn't have left it out there. And literally within 24 hours, just by talking to some neighbors and friends, they were like, oh, we think we might know where that is. And so we were able to track it down. And so there is just this sense of like history and connectedness and community that Churchill afforded so many of us, and that we're like really just are so grateful that we were over time invited in to be a part of that. Now, that has also been really difficult because 22 years into this journey, our neighborhood looks really different. And you think about the early days, I mean, there were probably 10 to 12 years where there was not really much change at all demographically in the neighborhood. But I think as nationwide, we saw this huge push for people to want to like move back into cities and to live in walkable and bikeable spaces close to downtown. The city started to see that opportunity and started to invest in our neighborhood. And so the health system that exists here started fueling businesses through grants, and the city started offering tax abatements for people who would come in and renovate houses. Um, and and all of that, sort of the collective of that, led to a significant amount of development and ultimate displacement for long-term residents who could no longer afford to keep up with the rising rent costs, or even if they were homeowners, like the increasing tax assessments ultimately pushed them out. And so I think those realities of gentrification and displacement have been very much a part of our time and our learning in Churchill, and in so many ways, for you and me, Lawson, I think Lawson spent a good chunk of her career in affordable housing. Um, like the reason we decided to run for office and ultimately sort of take this jump, like one of the big reasons was watching what happened to our community and feeling like that trend happening all over the country was going to continue to be the story in different neighborhoods in Richmond unless we got really proactive and intentional about stopping it. And I think in Lawson's work in affordable housing and my work in public health, um, understanding the way that policy can be leveraged, understanding the best practices on tax abatement programs or funding to help keep long-term homeowners in their homes. Like there are policy and programmatic levers that can be used to preserve diversity in communities, and so that was a huge motivator for us to kind of take this step and to be in a place where we could really center on keeping communities diverse and protecting particularly lower income residents who are vulnerable to those kind of community changes. What would you add to that? I mean, like, this has been your place of expertise for so long. I mean, maybe talk a little bit about like, uh, yeah, how that's prioritized certain policy issues for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you nailed it. I think we very much because of our faith and training in these principles. I think we really do believe that like authentic mutuality and that kind of seeking of mutual flourishing, like the only way to get it is to be in deep relationship with people that we're not like. And when I was in affordable housing, I would often share with folks like, literally what do all real estate agents say about uh you about like the value of a home? It's like location, location, location. And then we've literally built a market around separating ourselves from different things. My home, the single most important factor on the value of my home is the value of the homes around it. And that literally creates a market system that makes it very, very difficult for us to live in proximity to one another. And I know Brian Stevenson is a great leader in our nation right now, talks tons about proximity being an important factor. We've got, Raj Chetty's data that shows like that's the most important thing we can be doing for economic mobility is to be in relationship across opportunity, across income levels. And we have a system that was just built on something else and we've inherited it. And I think that's why it's why I'm passionate about Richmond being a leader in our nation, because we go around and visit other cities now, even in our roles here in the government, and you Richmond is trying to seek these values on top of layers and layers and layers and layers of historic injustice. And how do we do that? And you have to be working, in my opinion, you got to be doing both. Like we have to be working at the systemic level, and that has to be led by people who have the real individual relationships that are informing that system's work. And it's a both and I do think it informs our policy making every day, which is how do you prioritize the historically marginalized and focus on them in your kind of system design, but believing so deeply that that is what is best for everybody and healing for all of us. And I believe that in schools, I believe that in housing, I believe that kind of all across the sectors, working together. I mean, that's been a real deep joy for me working in City Hall. It's the most diverse environment I've ever worked in, actually, just racially, age, gender, just all of the things are here just because it's a big system, and it has blessed me. I learn and grow more in a diverse setting than I do when I'm not.
And I think that's true for our kids as well, right? Lawson mentioned, like investing in local schools has been a huge part of our life and our commitment. When we first moved here, my wife started teaching in the neighborhood elementary school. But all of our kids have come up through Richmond Public Schools. And, I think at times decisions that like their grandparents weren't so thrilled about, but for us, I'll be perfectly honest, like as an immigrant kid growing up in this country where my parents were like education, 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 every move and every decision that they made was like creating the best pathway for me and my brother. Like it was really hard to kind of look at like the academic outcomes or the colleges that kids from Richmond Public Schools at the time maybe had access to, and so early on there was some real internal wrestling, and I think my wife had a lot more clarity about what was important for us, and I think that collectively, as a group of friends committed to this kind of incarnational living and like really being in community and of community, I think there have been few things along this journey that have like embedded us as much in our community as our life in public schools, and just like having that shared experience with our neighbors and being part of the PTA together and having like just those social connections and run-ins because of school life has been an amazing part of like how we've been shaped and how we've been a part of this community. I think it's also worth talking about East End Fellowship and the story of East End. Lawson mentioned at the front end of this that she's been part of a CCDA congregation for 20 years, and when we first moved into the neighborhood, there were a lot of different churches in the neighborhood, but that story of many of those churches, predominantly African American churches, was a church that had been like sort of a parish model, like geographically very connected when those churches were established back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And over time, as the neighborhood changed and as largely, certainly the middle class and upper middle class white population left, and then subsequently the middle class black population left our neighborhood, the congregants left with them. And so those churches, though existing in our neighborhood, didn't actually have a lot of neighbors that went there. And so, in the early days, we ended up getting connected to the church that Mary Kay grew up in, and I think members of our group were sort of going in different directions, but also like doing the work of being involved in, Blue Sky Fund or affordable housing ministries or teaching in schools. And we had this incredible visit from John Perkins himself. After through some of the various connections, invited him up to Richmond, and he spent a long weekend like connecting with so many different peoples. Pastor Don was at the center of all of that. There was a youth serving ministry called Chat, Churchill Activities and Tutoring. And Dr. Perkins, at the end of his time with us, said, it's really beautiful to see God at work through all of these different activities and ministries and outputs. What I don't see is a faith community that is anchoring all of that. And I think that really became the impetus for Pastor Don and our other friends, Corey and Sarah, who had moved to join us. And Corey was working at another church, for Pastor Don and Corey to kind of decide that they were going to team up and lead a new congregation. And our families were both a part of that, and Lawson's family continues to serve there and be a part of that community. What would you add to that?
Oh yeah, no, just that it felt like it was this CCDA tour of various ministries, because there were a lot of others. North Side, South Side had some, Boaz and Ruth, and the Rock, and other things. And then it felt like we were getting like our report card at the end, and Dr. Perkins was giving us great marks, and then said, we're missing something here. You need a public expression of this being centered in the gospel. And we made quick work of believing that really was a prophetic word from the Lord. And I should never use a report card analogy when we're talking about the gospel. Forgive me. So very much the opposite of that. We really just heard God's kind of heart and grace through Dr. Perkins for our community to say, yeah, it's time to gather as a congregation and to name this deep heart motivation that's at play for all of this work. And we did, and Easton Fellowship was born. And it's fun. This upcoming weekend, actually, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary as a congregation, and there's a documentary coming out. I think this will all be a part of the fall when CCDA visits us as well, which will be great. So so I have one last question. I do kind of want to turn it maybe a little bit to the future, which is either if you want to just kind of give a message to, what would your hope be for CCDA, people and members to see or kind of gain from coming to Richmond, or maybe more broadly for you. You are the mayor of Richmond right now. What's your hope for the faith community to help us move Richmond towards, God's heart for the kingdom?
Yeah, I think kind of two things come to mind immediately. One is that the principles we learned early on from CCDA have been so instrumental to like forming who we are as Christians, as residents of the city, as like civically engaged people, and that idea that like we are all created in the image of God, and we need each other to fully express God's plan for us. You know, I think like the intentionality behind reaching across race and class and building relationships, as hard as that is in today's current societal context, like it could not be more important. And so seeking mutuality through intentionality, I want the people of God to continue moving in those ways, and making that a priority. Um, and then as a city, you know, like that story of where Richmond comes from, and what we have had to grapple through, and recognizing that in that there have been such incredible examples of resilience and of redemption, that like the world needs to hear. And it really is my hope, as the person who gets to sit in the seat for a season, that we do everything we can to help Richmond become known as not the capital of the Confederacy, but really the capital of reconciliation, or the capital of racial healing, right? Like to have come from that dark past into a place where everybody knows Richmond for the incredible things that are happening uh, now and into the future. So, yeah, that's my hope for our city, and it is my hope for the people of faith in the city. But I hope broadly for CCDA that that's something that you guys get to experience when you're here in October. I hope like getting to, you know, I hope that's a reason that you guys would actually come, because there have been amazing ways that God has been at work here, and we'd love to share that with you.
Well, thank you for listening to the CCDA podcast. Thank you, Danny, for all of your time. I know it is precious because I fill it up a lot. If you want to learn more about CCDA and how you can get involved, please check out the show notes of this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is produced by Sarah Kalin in association with Christina Four. We will be back soon with another episode featuring CCD practitioners who are committed to seeing people and communities experience God's shalom. We'll see you then.